Sisters.
Lobster lads.
Welcome.
Lobster lasses.
Round of applause for everyone joining us. Round of applause. You made it. You are breathtaking. You are beautiful. Thank you for making it.
You are a lobster.
We have a very special program for you this wonderful evening. But before we get into it, as always, we're going to start with a simultaneous sigh. All you have to do is take a deep breath in, let it out. It makes everything better, and you already know why. That's right. Today, it's going to even make the war in Ukraine better. I think we can do some good here. So ready? Without further ado, you know what to do. Deep breath in. Let it out. Did you hear that? I think they just signed a peace treaty.
Moving in the room.
I think that was a peace treaty getting signed. So, tonight, on this auspicious evening, we are going to listen to Akira the Don's phenomenal live scoring over a John Vervaeke lecture. So that's right, you are watching us watch Akira watch John Vervaeke while making a live score musical accompaniment to it. And Akira the Don performed this live, I think sometime last year, part of his epic meaning stream year-long tour de force, or whatever you'd like to call it. So we'll think we've got it queued up here in a good spot for us. And let's hit it.
They say, keep doing it. When I say they, I mean Scott Adams on that wonderful song. It feels like it works. Shouts out to that saxophone, which was recorded in 2004. And it was finally found its way onto a record that you could listen to. 17 years later. Incredible. Never give up, you know? And with that being said, it's time, brothers and sisters, to get after it, baby. It's a lo-fi lecture o'clock. It's a meaning crisis and chill. 15, Marcus Aurelius and Jesus.
Wait. 15. Oh. Whoopsie doodle. I knew Marcus Aurelius was a little bit too advanced for us.
Just let it roll, bro. We're live streaming. Do it.
No, we'll just switch over real quick. I know what happened. The playlist must be out of order. So
being said,
we're just going. I'll just pull up the right one.
Yeah, Marcus Aurelius and Jesus does sound very in the middle.
Here we go. That sounds about right.
In which I am going to.
Here we go.
Beautiful earth riding on the back of a torso, so whatever the heck this thing is. God bless, it's beautiful to be here.
Akira. He's got clout.
Welcome. This is a series in which I am going to endeavor to put together pretty much all of my work. My name's John Vervaeke. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. I'm in the psychology department and in the cognitive science program, and I also teach for the Buddhism, psychology, and mental health program. I produced a lot of videos on a lot of various topics. Some of you have perhaps seen them. But what I want to do now in this series is draw it all together and present to you an overall unified argument that can show you the interconnections between pieces that you might have seen before. Now, how all this got started is I got very interested in a particular phenomenon. I got interested in the fact that there seemed to be a growing confluence between people who are interested in Buddhism and people who are interested in cognitive science. We'll talk a little bit later as we go on what cognitive science is. But you know some of this already in the world at large because we're going through what's called the mindfulness revolution. Mindfulness is being spoken of everywhere. I was in a bookstore yesterday, chapters, and there's a whole section just on mindfulness itself. So why is the mindfulness revolution occurring? Well, it's occurring particularly because of this intersection between Buddhism and cognitive science. But why is this happening? And why is it, so explosive in nature? And what do we mean by mindfulness? Some of the work I've done is trying to get clear about that. We're going to talk about that in this series. Now, there's also a lot of other things that, in my mind, seem to be convergent with this growing confluence between Buddhism and cognitive science. There is an increasing interest, both academically and in the public at large, in the topic of wisdom. Something that people did not talk about very much not that long ago. Well, wisdom is now a very hot topic within psychology and cognitive science. And books offering to train you in wisdom are, again, becoming popular. Same bookstore experience yesterday. I bought my son a book called How to Be a Stoic. Right? This is like, how is it that a philosophical position from the Hellenistic era has become a popular book that people are seeking? Why is there this hunger for wisdom? And why are people meeting it with these kinds of things? The Stoicism, the philosophies of the Hellenistic period. I'm going to talk about that. I think there's good reason for that. Of course, there's increasing academic and public interest in psychedelics. I just gave a talk earlier this week at Yale about psychedelics and the increasing interest in psychedelics and psychedelic experiences. You're seeing radical things with them. People can be released from treatment-resistant addiction. They can overcome post-traumatic stress disorder. Like the normal with the best therapy, right? Solution rate for people with post-traumatic stress disorder is about, right? If things go really well, 20% or so. You introduce psychedelics into the therapy and you can get the healing rate up to 80%. So what's going on there? Why is there this interest? There's an increasing public interest, which is matched by a huge academic in the topics of happiness. Now, we've always been a happiness-oriented culture, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and so forth, right? But it's taken a particularly interesting turn. The topic of meaning and meaning in life is coming to the fore. People and more are talking about not just sort of sheer contentedness, but what it is for a human life to be meaningful. And it turns out that meaning in life is terrifically important. It's very predictive of well-being. It's very predictive of how well you are doing in your life in general. So it is no wonder that our people are seeking it out. Now, my contention and what I'm going to argue is it's no coincidence that all of these things are happening right now. It's no coincidence. This confluence between Buddhism, the mindfulness revolution, the interest in wisdom and ancient philosophies like Stoicism, the increasing public interest in psychedelics and transformative experiences and mystical experiences, right? The increasing academic and public interest in meaning in life. There's all a reason for, there's a unifying account for why this is happening. But there's another set of things. This is sort of the light side of what I'm talking about. There's a set of dark factors that seem to be converging as well, right? We have what seems to be, although there, people are disputing it, but I think the evidence is becoming clearer and clearer. The CDC just released some data recently. We're going through a mental health crisis. Suicide is spiking, and it's, right? Now, there are some socioeconomic factors, but there's clearly other things that are at work. Right? There's an increasing sense, many people are expressing it, of losing touch with reality. We encounter more and more often in individuals and groups nihilism, expressions of cynicism, expressions of deep kinds of frustration and futility. You have the abandonment of trust in any of our public institutions. We're losing, right, we've completely lost any sort of faith or trust in our political system. We're losing faith in our judicial system, right? Religious affiliation is declining consistently throughout. People's participation in, right, clubs, organization is in decline. In general, and my co-authors on the book on zombies in Western culture, the 20th, 21st century crisis, Chris Massapietro and Philip Misevic, we argued, right, that the sense of being out of touch has gone on with an increasing sense, and we'll talk about this because I'm going to use this term technically. We're going to talk about this and Frankfurt's use of it. There's an increasing sense of more and more bullshit everywhere, pervading. And if you take a look at the book, we actually chart how this has been spiking, and it's concorded with all kinds of other increases in these dark factors. People are getting the sense that we're spending, and you can see this already in the public media, but it's also within the academic world, that we're spending too much time in our virtual environments. There seems to be increasing evidence, for example, of a connection between various social media, increased depression, increased loneliness.
What are you uh-ohing?
Spending too much time virtually, that's
and
us.
then more in general, and we'll talk about how this shows up a little bit more implicitly. It shows up in the entertainment we seek and the mythologies we like the zombies. We're going to talk about that. Why are zombies so big, right? Why are superheroes so big right now, right? There's an increase, these mythological, we'll talk about what myth means, these mythological forms, I'm going to argue are expressions of a cultural sense, a sense that we're stuck somehow. One way you can note that is just by noting how pervasive, almost to the point of being a constant factor in our background, is people talking about crisis and collapse, apocalypse, the zombie apocalypse, the imminent collapse of civilization. All of these things are now pervasive. They're taken for granted. At one point, right, the movies demonstrating this had to be sort of science fiction. They were considered radical, right? But now, this is becoming a pervasive background sense. Now, I think all of these negative factors also have a unifying explanation. In fact, what I'm going to argue throughout the course of this series is that the positive factors and the negative factors all point to a unified explanation. This is going to be an idea that our culture is experiencing a profound meaning crisis, a crisis in meaning. Now we're going to have to talk about what does that meaning mean. No, I'm not claiming that this is the only crisis we're facing. Far from it. What I want to do, in fact, is talk about how the meaning crisis is interacting with other crises. The environmental crisis, the socioeconomic crisis. But in addition to those, which are quite well discussed in the public at large, there is a meaning crisis, which is being discussed quite significantly within academia, but needs to be brought to the public at large. Because one of the things I'm going to argue is that these three crises are not independent from each other. They're interdependent in important ways. But what is this meaning that's come into crisis? Why do we hunger for it? How do we cultivate the wisdom, because that's what I'm going to argue wisdom is ultimately about, to generate, enhance this meaning? Wisdom is about realizing, in both senses of the word, becoming aware and making real. Wisdom is about realizing meaning in life in a profound way. How do we cultivate this wisdom? What does it mean? And I'm not going to talk about that just practically. I'm going to talk, not just theoretically, I'm going to talk about that practically as well. What are some practices that people can engage in and are engaging in to try and address this need for the cultivation of wisdom? What role, for example, do mindfulness practices play within the cultivation of wisdom? So here's the three questions that we're going to keep coming back to again and again and again. What is this meaning? Why do we hunger for it? And how do we cultivate the wisdom to realize it? So some of the topics, of course, we're going to be addressing are centrally the meaning crisis. How did this kind of meaning evolve? What is it? Why is it so important to the evolution of our humanity? Then more specifically, the history of the meaning crisis. Why did it arise? What are the historical factors? By doing that, we'll get a historical account of meaning. We'll get a sense of what this meaning is that has come into crisis, that people individually feel they are lacking or losing in their lives. We want to talk about connections between meaning, wisdom, and importantly, self-transcendence. It's going to turn out that this notion of self-transcendence, again, which we'll have to develop and explicate, is something that's a core need because it forms core functions for human beings. It's bound up with these ideas of wisdom and, of course, meaning. And along the way, in fact, right from the beginning, we're going to start to see that there's deep connections between meaning, wisdom, self-transcendence, and altered states of consciousness. Why do human beings seek to alter their consciousness? In fact, not just human beings, other intelligent organisms seek to do this, right? Caledonian crows will tumble down roofs in order to make themselves dizzy for no other purpose than to alter their state of consciousness. What is going on? Why does intelligence need to be conjoined to an altered state of consciousness? And why in particular have human beings developed very sophisticated processes generating, harnessing, and interpreting these altered states of consciousness? We're going to talk about that in connection with shamanism and ritual. We're going to talk about that in connection to the flow state. This is when you're in the zone, and why people seek it, and why it's so powerful. We're going to talk about it, as I mentioned, in connection with psychedelic experiences. More importantly, the mystical experiences that can occur within some psychedelic experience, because it turns out it's the mystical experience that is more important and transformative. But there's a subset of those mystical experiences that are very crucial. These are awakening experiences. These are experiences in which people come back from the mystical experience and say, that was somehow more real than this, and I need to change my world. I need to change myself. They engage in what L.A. Paul has called a transformative experience, what is also known as quantum change, a radical transformation of their lives. And we know, we've got good research now showing that they're right. Their lives get better after these awakening experiences. We're going to talk about that in depth. And dare I say it, maybe we can bring all of this together and actually propose, and maybe some people will be affronted by this, but propose a cognitive, scientific account of what enlightenment is and why it alleviates the suffering from lack of meaning that is particularly pertinent for us today, but has always been a perennial threat since the axial revolution. Now that means, of course, we're going to have to also talk about topics that have connection with the darker aspects, as I said, of meaning making. What's the connection, because they're deep and profound, between this meaning making that is so central and our endemic capacity for self-deception, for self-destruction. There's a reason why we are so awash in bullshit, because bullshit is a perennial threat to us. Self-deception is endemic. That means it'll be important to talk about foolishness as something different from ignorance. Ignorance is a lack of knowledge. Foolishness is a lack of wisdom. Foolishness is when your capacity to engage your agency, pursue your goals, is undermined and threatened by the self-deception and the self-destructive behavior that is like a perennial vulnerability to your cognition. In fact, what I'm going to argue is the very same machinery that makes you so adaptively intelligent is the same machinery that makes you susceptible to foolishness. That will take us into some of the topics that are relevant to people's existential experience, meaning crisis. Topics like absurdity, alienation, futility, horror, real horror. Most horror movies aren't horror. We'll talk about what horror really is and what people experience when they're actually experiencing horror. Their sense of grip on reality is being undermined. And people find that, as you can imagine, terrifying. We're going to talk about meaninglessness and why more people experience this state of despair. And once we do that, right, as we're moving into these kinds of topics, we will be moving gradually from the historical account of the origin of the meaning crisis, which will give us some sense from the history of what this meaning is, but we'll be moving into the cognitive scientific study of cognition, the cognitive scientific investigation of meaning and meaning making. Look, when people use this word meaning, it's a metaphor. They mean there's something in their life that is analogous to how a sentence has meaning. The pieces fit together in some way. They make an impact on your cognition and connect you to the world in some way. There's something about our lives that is analogous to the way sentences have meaning. We have to unpack that metaphor. Why is the metaphor used, and what does the metaphor point to when we talk about the meaning of our lives? How is it, in fact, that some of the most meaningful experiences people have are precisely ones that are completely ineffable to them, that they can't put into words? What's going on? We're going to have to talk about different kinds of knowing, some of them that have fallen off our cultural radar, precisely because of the meaning crisis. We tend to have reduced all of the ways that the ancients talked about how we know to one thing. To know is to have a special kind of belief. And so we are very belief-centric, which is why we are so focused as a culture on ideologies. But it turns out that we're going to have a much more expanded notion of what knowing means. There's much more to knowing than having justified true beliefs. There's the kind of knowing that's involved in knowing how to catch a baseball. There's the kind of knowing of what it is like to be having this experience right now. There's the kind of knowing that is knowing what it's like to be in something you're participating in, like a relationship. We're going to have to talk about all of that. Now, of course, some of you might be aware of those other kinds of knowing because you know how integral and important they are to therapy, which is another thing that is booming in our culture. Part of why it's booming is the meaning crisis. Part of why it's booming is because people seek out therapy precisely because they're trying to recover these lost kinds of knowing. The kinds of insight that is needed, the kind of transformation, not of your beliefs, but of how you see things. Your sense of self and your sense of realness have to be transformed often in therapy. That is why the psychedelics are so important for therapeutic success, because they transform these other kinds of knowing. We're going to talk about all of that. This will give us a structural, functional account of meaning. What is the structure of it? What are its cognitive processes? What are its cognitive mechanisms? How do they function? How can they fall into dysfunction? We're going to have this historical account and this structural, functional account, and we're going to make them talk to each other. They're going to inform and constrain and enable each other. And from that dialogue, what I propose, audacious as it might sound, is a real response to the meaning crisis. An awakening from the meaning crisis. That's what this series is about. Awakening from the meaning crisis.
That's what I'm
Not
talking
in some
about.
ideological fashion, but in a profound, transformative, and existential manner. So this is not something that I can do simply, because this is not a problem for which there are simplistic answers. If anybody offers you an answer to this crisis in an hour, I would wager that they are deceiving you,
Return to
manipulating, or they are themselves
tradition.
significantly self-deceiving.
Reject modernity.
There's a reason why we're stuck. There's a reason why this is hard. This is a complex and difficult thing we are undertaking. So this series is going to be several videos long, because I'm going to carefully, and I hope responsibly, build an argument to try and show how we can awaken from the meaning crisis, how that meaning crisis interacts with the mental health crisis, how it interacts with the environmental crisis, how it interacts with the socio-economic crisis. Now, this is my commitment to you. I will always do my best to offer rigorous, rational argumentation. I will try my best to give proper scholastic credit to other people. Please understand that I'm aware that I'm not, and nobody should be, claiming to offer you the absolute uncontested truth. I'm going to offer you good arguments, good evidence. But I don't want this to be an academic series. I do my academic work, and I'm proud of it. But I want this to be for people who are coming to this precisely because of a genuine personal existential interest. So I will try to keep jargon and technicalities to a minimum. I will have to introduce terms to you, and I hope to explain them carefully along the way. So, my commitment to you is to, I can't be unbiased. That's not a thing. What I will try my best to do is to present to you my arguments, my viewpoints, and why I think they can be understood to be highly plausible. So, I want to start with how and why is this meaning so much a part of our humanity? Why is it sewn in to our humanity so much? And I think the thing that we want to understand is I have to start somewhere, right? And that can be misleading, because I think, and one of my co-authors, Philip Misevich, this is something that he's very concerned with, right? I think this is a continuum question. I think the deep connections between meaning making and cognition go deeply back into our evolutionary heritage, way before our humanity. But that's right. So the fact that I'm starting somewhere is not meant to indicate that this is the absolute starting point. What I want to do is point to a time when many people think our humanity, the kind of people we are now, came into form, not fully like the way it is now, because of course there's been lots of historical and cultural processes, but the kind of humanity that we would recognize as us, and how much this was bound up with meaning making in the way that I've been talking about. So this period is known as the Upper Paleolithic transition. It occurs around 40,000 BCE. Now, what's interesting about this is that biologically, as a species, we had existed much longer than this. We existed about, of course, there's some controversy around this, but conservatively, since about 200,000 BCE. But around, again, roughly 40,000 BCE, there's a change, a radical change. Now, again, picking a specific time makes it look like there's nothing before, there are no precursors. Some people have presented the Upper Paleolithic transition that way. I'm not doing that. I think that's a mistake. There's a continuum, you can see it back, but at some point there's this radical change, the Upper Paleolithic transition. You see things, human beings doing things they're not doing before. They're making art. They're making representational art. They're making sculpture. They're making cave paintings. We have good evidence they start making music. What else are they doing? Well, we have some pretty good evidence, right, that there's significant enhancement in their cognition. How do we know this? Well, we have the first use of calendars. Obviously not with numbers and dates, because numeracy hasn't been invented, but you have the symbolic representation of the phases of the moon and the passage of days. And so human beings are keeping track of time across very abstract patterns so that they can enhance their hunting abilities. Something else is happening, which, again, it's so intrinsic to our humanity, right? We're developing projectile weapons.
Nice.
We're developing projectile weapons. So the Neanderthals, who are contemporaneous with Homo sapiens at this time, don't have projectile weapons. Their spears are thick-shafted, heavy stone. They're thrusting tools. We know that they were getting in close to their quarry because they have bone damage that's similar to the kind of bone damage we see in.
Yep.
It is interesting when you hear about, like, just biologically evolutionary, that there was like two different subspecies of humanity operating, and it does raise to my mind, just if we take these things for granted, not saying I necessarily ascribe to them, but there's these lines in the Old Testament that there were the sons of Cain and the sons of Seth, and the sons of Seth were more agriculture based, and like the implication almost is that they were more intelligent, or they were more like they knew how to do things so that they didn't have to like travel in herds and be hunter gatherers. And then this idea that Cain and his descendants are like really the first hunter gatherers, and the people that did eventually form cities, but they were like moving cities. It's just interesting. It's interesting that's what that provoked for me, but nothing particularly profound. But you can play it again.
Yeah, we are going to have to cut this off pretty soon and move into discussion. So basically, since we've stopped here, we might as well make this a stopping point. Essentially, that's the introduction of the series. John Vervaeke's Meaning, Crisis, and Chill, as scored by Akira the Don. And that's the introduction. That's what he's trying to accomplish throughout this series. And this is the appropriate time to ask ourselves the question, are we interested in this? Are we interested in going through with the series, and why? I think that I've actually already listened to it, and I had the desire to rewatch it. So that's a pretty clear indication. What about yourself?
Yeah, I think for me, I'd like to hear what he has to say. I mean, coming from my milieu and the framework that I operate from, the questions that he raises regarding meaning, why is this happening? Why are suicide rates so high? What's going on? I believe I already have an answer to from the framework I operate from, but I am very interested to hear what his perspective on it is. I think mine's kind of close to like you used a an image, this idea. I forget, you're maybe quoting someone, I can't remember exactly, but it was the idea that like you have this beautiful like architecture and paintings and whatever, and then what the postmodernist thought has done is thrown up like this canvas or this lens, and it distorts what's behind it so that all you see is like tyrannical patriarchy, unjust slavery and economic systems and misogyny and all this other stuff. And so then they convince people to like shoot down and destroy this effigy, this scapegoat, but really the bullets are just passing through this illusion, this misrepresentation, and taking out the actual culture of value. And it raises the question of like, okay, you're demolishing this, but what do you have to put in its place? And
Not
so for
only that,
me,
but with under misguided pretext and without fully ever coming to explore it or understand what it was and why it was what it had been.
sure. And I think in that particular strain of thought, the church, the Catholic Church, is the prime example in the West of, Archbishop Sheen said that not millions of people in America. He said this in the 50s. Millions of Americans hate what they think the Catholic Church is. No,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
he said something like,
Straw man argument.
yeah,
They
he
um
millions of people hate what they think the church is and
yeah.
what it teaches, but only about 100 hate what it actually is.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's like this. I'm probably butchering it, but it's this idea that like no one has actually gone and explored the moral underpinnings of like, hey, don't do that. That leads to hell. And like, well, what is hell really? Is it just a metaphysical something that you go to when you die, or is it something that you take part in now and share in now and create in some sense now? And so, to me, what Vervaeke is drawing attention to is that the postmodernist rejection of, and I'm this is what I mean. I'm interested to hear what he has to say, because for me the answer is, well, it's easy. The foundation of the West was the idea that being is essentially for our benefit, that we're images of something beautiful, that and through that acknowledgement we're called to this higher acknowledgement of one another's value, and we have intrinsic value, and those things, like, so God is, we're in the image of that dictates how I treat other people, and then the whole thing is like a structure. And if I remove any of those foundational elements, the what is my purpose, what is existence, why am I here, all of a sudden they're big question marks. And communism and socialism and fascism and all these materialist ideologies did a really good job at convincing people that that stuff's a bunch of nonsense. And we see what it led to. There is no transcendent, you're not important, human life has no inherent value. And then you can just you can scapegoat or delimit people into undesirable groups and then genocide them. And now in the next century, we feel like we're civilized because we've moved beyond that, but we're still now wrestling with these giant vacuous gaps of question of, why am I here? Is this all there is? And unfortunately, because we've trained people to be materialist in an industrialist society, it's crushingly overbearing. So to me, it's a given that the suicides rates would be higher and that there would be a meaning crisis, because the foundational framework on which the West has operated and grown from has been completely rejected. So that, for me, is the main reason why I would like to continue, because I'm genuinely curious to find out what his diagnosis of the situation is. And he talked about proto-Buddhism and mindfulness and how he feels he has a solution to these society crushing issues. So I'm interested on that level.
Yeah, I feel like we definitely need an antidote to that. And it's kind of nice to see the popularity, although I haven't been able to put my finger on the pulse of the general culture of these ideas, the popularity that they're getting. For example, Jordan Peterson's fame and some independent voices reaching prominence in our media, Tim Pool, Joe Rogan. And I do think that, like, Jordan Peterson makes a compelling argument with the Gutenberg Revolution, except in video, something we're participating in right now. I mean, think about how much of a miracle it is that John Vervecke recorded and put out for free on the internet what is essentially an entire college course that then my favorite musician did a live scoring musical accompaniment to, and then my friend and I are going to rebroadcast this with our commentary and to put a discussion out that is as accessible to everyone on the entire planet. So there is some fertile opportunities for profound change, and I want to take personal responsibility for helping to manifest the change that's going to awaken us. And I think the proper place to start is sort of at the beginning. And that's kind of part of what I want to do from this chat with this channel, is kind of echo in a small way what John Vervecke is doing himself. And I have a feeling that he goes into a meditative place and then discusses with intellectuals the frontier of his own knowledge and them, and in a creative, spontaneous flow state, allow for an intellectual fountain to emerge. And he's a PhD and a professor at the University of Toronto, so I'm not quite ready to interview, Bishop Barron myself yet. So here's where we're starting, and I think that's a good place for a lot of my good friends to join me if they're interested. Part of my quest to do, as I like to say, like perfect myself in masculine virtue, so to speak, and my quest to understand like where I am in the broader story of the Western world of my ancestors has been to read the great works of the Western world, starting with it's the literature. So you said the church is a big part of that. Another big part of that in the Western world. Sorry, you said that the church is a big foundational institution of the Western world, and
that isn't often explored and is just kind of out of hand dismissed. But yes, I
right,
also
right.
believe that. Yes.
And I mean the library, the courthouse, democracy, um, the university, and maybe perhaps martial arts to some extent. Physical training, the gymnasium, the Olympics are part of that tradition also. And the like fundamental curriculum for most of the most influential figures and intellectuals has been pretty much reading the Western canon of literature, sometimes in its original text, pre-Civil War up, you know, in pre-Civil War America, and for a little while afterwards, um, the expectation of any freshman entering an Ivy League school was to have read the classics, the ancient Greek and Latin texts, um, in their original, and that was the basis of their curriculum. And there are a few schools that still adhere to that. There has been a modernization of the education system that, I mean, personally, I didn't benefit from reading some of the assigned readings over what had been replaced. Like it wasn't an incremental improvement in my conception. So that's another thing that I want to add into the mix, like little sharing my kind of self-study of the classics, and then yeah, meditation practice and this kind of stuff. It's also fun, you know. I hope everyone has fun with it as well.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's good. I think that, people don't realize that, well, the Grecian philosophy and Roman law are probably 2/3 of the bedrock of the West. And I would say the third pillar is Hebraic spirituality and conception of God. Those three things became one thing in the church. And without the monastic orders preserving, once Rome fell and Byzantium became the new capital and then it fell, that 500-year period, you had men giving up their lives to get married and other things, and they would be consumed with copying texts their whole lives of the classics. The scripture, of course, was a given, but the classics, the things from the Roman period, things from the Grecian period. And so the medieval era and the Enlightenment that followed it could not have happened unless the church had um,
Preserved it, respected
preserved
it,
it.
done the work.
So there's a there's a kind of a missing link there, I think, for a lot of people. When you're in, like, high school art history class and they call it the Dark Ages, it's kind of like this almost this slander, like back in the early 19th century they called Africa the Dark Continent. And that has multiple meanings. It's dark because it's unenlightened, it's barbaric, and also because dark-skinned people live there. And in kind of a very literalist, ignorant way, historians call the 600s to the 1000s the Dark Ages, even sometimes a little bit further, the 1100s, when really historically it's seen as the period that was illuminated by Christ, where yes, civilized order had failed, yes, the barbarian hordes had overrun what was now the West, what is now the West. They already owned, and they had come all the way down to the Mediterranean, wiped everything out. And it was this slow, centuries long rebuilding and collecting and preserving that served as the nucleus for what would become the modern European states, which led to the Protestant Revolution, which paved the way for a radical type of individualization and self-conception, which was the groundwork for the Enlightenment, which then led to the modern era. So, people just don't really take for granted.
And then what we're ushering now, which is the American Awakening, the return to tradition in the United States. But we will perhaps take from it what is most useful, and very carefully with discerning judgment cast away things which are no longer useful to us. But certainly not dismiss all of it.
God willing, we have what did Solomon say? A heart, I think I have the quote here somewhere, a heart to know the good from the bad.
Right. It's a big emphasis of Stoicism.
He says, give thy servant therefore an understanding mind to govern thy people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to govern this thy great people? I pulled this up because Vervecki had talked about wisdom, and wisdom being specifically, essentially, this tool that helps you live well. And I went, that doesn't sound right. That sounds like a fundamental reduction of what I understand wisdom to be. So I did some research, and it's the wisdom from the tradition is, one, the art of living, which he's addressing. Second, thinking deeply, which he's also addressing. But then there's this third form, which is probably the most controversial, and it's wisdom from God. So it's stages of the reality. So I found that part mildly eyebrow raising, but I'm interested to hear his thought, because clearly he's very well regarded amongst, Peterson gives him great regard, Jonathan Pageau gives him great regard, Bishop Barron and he had a very compelling engagement, and I found myself surprised in the video is called The Four Horsemen of Meaning.
Oh yeah,
and
that one was
I found
intense.
I'm sorry?
A lot of that went over my head.
Really? I followed along pretty well, and I was surprised at how much Vervecki agreed with, particularly when, Barron and Vervecki would build off one another. And it was just very interesting. It was a very compelling conversation. In fact, that is something I'd want to watch again at some point as well, because I watched it now maybe 4 months ago, and it was the type of thing where I sat there wide-eyed, my mouth open, going like, this is it's so much. It's like I'm following it, but it's almost like the type of following where like you're following the ball. Like, okay, now they're pitching it, now they're hitting it, but like I'm from a distance, in the bleachers. So you really gotta so I'd like to get up close maybe and try to break some of it down. Maybe do digestible chunks of, because I think it's like 2 hours. Like maybe do like
Yeah,
30 minutes here.
we'll get around to it. All right, so why don't we just leave this here and look forward to the next time we stream. Gonna maybe send a few invites out. Share this with your friends. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And most importantly, clean your room and wake up. Wake up from the meaning crisis.
Lobster lads and lasses unite!